Omnioculus is getting nerfed, to which you might say, Mac, I clicked on this video to see if I should run 100 resilience. Why are you talking about Omnioculus nerfs? And yeah, that's a reasonable question, but it all ties together. You see, the answer to the resilience question is more complex than yes, you should run it, or no, you should not. And to arrive at that answer, we need to step back a little bit. Many moons ago, when I made the Omnioculus playbook, my stat recommendation was to prioritize mobility, discipline, and strength in that order. But that was before resilience was buffed to grant a whopping 40% damage resistance with 100% uptime, unlike the 40% damage resistance granted by Omnioculus only when invisible. So now that resilience makes you a super tank, you all have been asking, what is the new recommendation? Well, early on in the season, my answer was that the new recommendation was identical to the previous one, meaning resilience, like before, was not a priority. You might think, why in the wide world of sports would you not want 40% damage resistance at all times? And my reasoning was the same reasoning used to not prioritize recovery. The idea of the Omnioculus Hunter build and playstyle was that, if executed properly, you were invisible close to 100% of the time. And if you are invisible 100% of the time, no enemy is ever shooting you, meaning you are never taking any damage, meaning stats that mitigate and heal damage, like resilience and recovery respectively, were simply not necessary. Now, of course, that is on paper. The reality of the situation is that you will mess up a cooldown rotation here and there, or choke a gambler's dodge smoke refresh once in a blue moon, and in those situations, yeah, resilience sure would be nice to weather the storm until your cooldowns come back. But I felt that prioritizing your other ability regenerating stats, such as mobility to get your dodge back faster, strength to get your smokes back faster, and discipline to create elemental wells with elemental ordnance on grenade kills more often, was a much more sensible approach. It's also very well worth noting that Omnioculus gives us a version of tier 10 resilience whenever we are invisible, which, again, if we are playing well, is close to 100% of the time. So it seemed very overkill to spec into the Titan favorite stat when we were already getting its effects from our armor piece. But then PvP players started to try out Omnioculus, and it worked well, but unfortunately it worked a little too well. If you browse any Destiny social media space like Bungie forums, Twitter, Reddit, or obviously YouTube, you know that the damage resistance component of the Omnioculus chess piece is wreaking havoc on the PvP playlists on a daily basis, so much so that every PvP player is roaring for nerfs as soon as possible on our beloved chess piece, and rightly so. I've seen this thing in action and even been on the receiving end of its effects in PvP many times over the past few weeks, and it is most certainly not balanced. It needs to be nerfed in PvP, there is no doubt about that, but as we all know far too well, sometimes there is collateral damage to be had, and depending on what that collateral damage is specifically will determine what our new stat prioritization will be for PvE Omnioculus hunters. In my eyes, there are two situations that are most likely to arise. The first, and more favorable of the two, is that Bungie changes the damage resistance perk on the Omnioculus to only work against enemy combatants, which is Destiny speak for PvE enemies. Theoretically, this would end its reign of terror on the PvP community, keep it nice and tidy in the PvE community, all would be happy, you would subscribe to my YouTube channel, world hunger would end, disease would vanish, and world peace would be achieved. But the tragic story of the Renewal Grasp's gauntlets tells us that there is another, more painful path to possibly be taken. As short as 5 months ago, Renewal Grasps were wreaking the same havoc on the PvP space with a 50% damage reduction while standing inside your Duskfield grenade, and from any damage coming from enemies that are inside your Duskfield grenade. Meanwhile, in PvE, players were loving these gauntlets and activities where enemies hit incredibly hard like Grandmaster Nightfalls to remain safe in even the scariest of situations. With a base cooldown of 62 seconds, shortened to 25 seconds with tier 10 discipline, you could launch these grenades on a regular basis, which was a blast in PvE, but absolutely dreadful in PvP. Bungie's solution to the matter, arriving on April 21st, 2022, was to drop the damage resistance from 50% to 20% in PvP only, which was amazing, but to also increase the base cooldown of the Duskfield grenade from 62 seconds to 152 seconds while the exotic is equipped in every aspect of the game, effectively murdering the exotic across the board. Why would Bungie do this? They were good in PvE, yeah, but certainly not overpowered or busted enough to warrant a nerf this large. Clearly, Bungie knew the issue with these gauntlets was PvP specific, as indicated by the damage resistance only being modified in that game mode. So why would they make the grenade cooldown nerf an all-encompassing one rather than just in PvP as well? Now, I don't work at Bungie, but I know damn well that game development is not easy in the slightest. It can be incredibly difficult to make even the smallest of tweaks to a video game, considering how interconnected everything is. One small tweak can take hundreds of adjustments in a code base just to make sure nothing else breaks as a result, meaning these things can take time. Lots of time. But when you have players having their weekends ruined time and time again because the Trials of Osiris is full of overpowered snow globes, time isn't exactly a luxury you have. You need to get a fix out as soon as possible so the game isn't miserable to play, without creating hundreds of other issues as a result of the code change necessary to make the fix. So, where is this all going? Well, I would imagine that damage resistance values on a single exotic armor piece are much easier to adjust compared to creating separate grenade cooldown timers depending on which mode you are in. One of the changes is hyper-specific to a single exotic on a single class, while the other targets an ability managed by the same cooldown systems that manage every single ability cooldown timer in the game. Surely it's obvious which one of these is more complicated and therefore more time-consuming to change. So, how does this relate to Omnioculus? Well, it's entirely possible that the damage resistance of Omnioculus could be tweaked in PvP specifically, granting 0% resistance in PvP and 40% in PvE. But it's also possible that Bungie is focused on developing other things, and doesn't have the extra time necessary to make these focused and more time-consuming tweaks, instead opting to hit it with the blanket nerf that Renewal Grasps received. And while we can't predict or control the future, we can prepare for it. So, how much resilience do you need? The ultimate answer is, well, it's up to you. No matter what happens to the damage resistance on Omnioculus, the same philosophy remains true. If you are invisible 100% of the time, you are never taking damage and thus do not need damage resistance. In fact, the damage resistance on Omnioculus was never truly for the user, but rather for our allies that we made invisible immediately after reviving them in the middle of 20 enemies, allowing them to have some extra padding while they get targeted during that millisecond of visibility as they transmatted back in. That doesn't necessarily mean resilience is always useless though. Like we said before, there is always going to be a situation where you'll mess up a combo, screw up a dodge, and so on and so forth, in which case resilience is awesome. But as you grow in experience with the class, that becomes less and less necessary. Or does it? You see, I've been playing around with a lot of different stuff recently, and I have actually found 3 different stat builds that I really enjoy, and it's your job to select which one is best suited for you depending on your experience level, preferred playstyle, and the future of Omnioculus. The first is the traditional setup showcased in the Omnioculus playbook, which, by the way, if you haven't seen that yet, it's linked in the description. Mobility, discipline, and strength are still firing on all cylinders. You would be sitting pretty sticking with this one should Omnioculus remain unchanged in PvE. The second option, however, is a slight variation of this, prioritizing resilience as your third stat instead of strength. The reality is, the 16-second smoke bomb refresh from tier 10 mobility makes any passive melee ability regeneration from your strength stat quite negligible. If you're consistently dodging in range of enemies and getting that smoke bomb refresh, you'll hardly be missing that strength stat at all, allowing you to spec into some resilience to allow for longer windows of aggressive, uninvisible combat. So if you've got that dodge radius down to a science, swapping out your strength for resilience can work just fine. The third variation, though, the one that I have been absolutely loving recently, will probably be my go-to should the damage resistance be removed from Omnioculus. We prioritize mobility and resilience equally, running 100 in both. Considering your dodge is up every 16 seconds with tier 10 mobility and utility kickstart, with elemental wells and well of utility further reducing that cooldown, you'll be dodging 24/7. And as we know, dodging not only means invisibility, but another smoke charge as well. Throw the resilience stat into the mix, and you've got a recipe that allows you to play extremely aggressive, being able to take shots in between every invis cooldown, leaving invis early to drop a target, and even being able to take some hits while out of invisibility, all thanks to that increased damage resistance and our existing well generation capabilities. I know I said you don't need resilience considering you are invisible 100% of the time, but the drawback of the strategy necessary to achieve that is a significant limitation of your ability to kill enemies quickly. That won't always be a problem, but for those situations where you need to be able to fully embody the lethality aspect of the Wraith playstyle, having the capability of being outside of invis to drop a pack of multiple adds in quick succession thanks to your increased durability can be incredibly valuable. The resistance is not used for defense. Quite the opposite, in fact. Resilience can be a key to unlocking your offensive capabilities, and when used properly, will not only make the potential loss of Omnioculus's damage resistance irrelevant, but will also make you more lethal than ever before. Now, I could have said that all right at the beginning of the video, but I didn't, and there is a good reason for that. You see, like I said back in the Omnioculus playbook, knowing things is only half the battle. Understanding the reasoning behind it all is just as important. The goal of this channel is not just to educate you on the how, but the why as well. If I can teach you how to assess nerfs, analyze your toolkit, and conjure builds and battle plans with these videos, then you'll grow to be your own teacher and be able to overcome anything. Never forget that you are your strongest weapon. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please consider liking and subscribing if you did. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a great day.